Welcome to the podcast series Shifting the Narrative Women Leading Change by the Sahel and West African Club SWAC Secretariat. The Sahel and West African Club Secretariat is hosted at the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, the OECD, and is an independent international platform. It produces innovative evidence-based analysis and research to inform and support more place-based policies. SWAC's new MAPTA platform, Mapping Territorial Transformations in Africa, uses maps to explain key ongoing transformations in West Africa, including in the area of security. This podcast series tells the stories of women as civil society actors, activists, authors, leaders, health and humanitarian workers, youth representatives, traders, and entrepreneurs in the Sahel and West Africa. We gather first-hand examples of their outstanding work within local communities, as well as their important contributions to advancing gender equality and positive change. These conversations also aim to better connect the Sahel and West African Club SWAC Secretariat's evidence-based analysis with civil society advocacy and action through dialogue and knowledge exchange.
My name is Dr. Jumo Ayandele, and I am delighted to be your host for this inaugural podcast. Our first guest is Dr. Fatima Akilu. She is the Executive Director of the NEEM Foundation, a leading crisis response organization, and the former Director of the Behavioral Analysis and Strategic Communication Unit at the Office of the National Security Advisor in Nigeria, where she helped develop the country's first countering violent extremism program. Welcome, Dr. Akilu.
Well, thank you so much, Jumo. It's really a pleasure to be here with you to discuss these issues.
And it's a pleasure having you. So let's get started. Let's get right to it. I'm sure our listeners want to hear your perspective. Dr. Akilu, conflict has been a recurring theme in West Africa. We've seen that violent events have become more frequent and deadly in recent years. So clusters of violence in the Central Sahel and in the Lake Chad region have tended to spread across borders. SWAC has published a number of innovative analyses to improve the knowledge base on the underlying dynamics of conflict in the region. One example is the 2022 SWAC's report on borders and conflict, which highlights that borderlands in West Africa have become increasingly more violent and involve more belligerents. Another example is SWAC's latest report on political violence targeting women in West Africa, which demonstrates that women are facing unprecedented levels of targeted violence with worrying consequences for their livelihoods and survival. Now, given the work that you do in crisis response and management, what do you find most interesting about these reports? What are your thoughts as an actor on the ground?
Well, I think first of all, thank you so much for the team that put this report together. I mean, it's so important for us that are practitioners on the ground to have evidence, an evidence base for the work that we do, because very often I feel that we're working in the dark, as sometimes we don't have the resources or the capacity to do the kind of analysis that this report has done. When you look at borders, historically, really, borders have been there have promoted integration, economic advancement. People across borders share cultures, and it's really families live across borders. So they have been activities along the border have been really, really positive in many ways for an integrated. Um, so they are artificial borders, if you like, because we have boundaries that are geographically delineated across countries, but borders have shown us that sometimes these boundaries are more artificial than we think. But in recent times, as the report points out, borders have also really helped us in the way that we better understand the way that conflict has morphed, especially in the last decade. The regionalization of conflict across border communities, the internationalization of these same conflicts, where people from different countries now are learning from each other across borders. This is particularly so from where I stand in the Lake Chad basin. You can see what has happened, where you have all these different actors that have descended in these border regions and are fomenting political conflict. And what the report really highlights is the importance of understanding how these dynamics operate and the need for a better, more integrated, perhaps even more nuanced approach to conflict. And I think, in particular, what we've seen is that when there's been response across border communities or borderlands or borders, if you like, it has been mostly militarized. In Nigeria, Nigeria led an effort to bring together countries that share contiguous borders together with the multinational joint task force, but it hasn't really been matched with a more civilian type of response. And I think just going through this report, it highlights the importance of that. And there are opportunities where we can do better planning in response to cross-border conflict.
Yes, very, very important points that you have raised about borders, about winning the hearts and minds of populations, and having more civilian-led programs and policies in really trying to stem the conflict that we see in borderlands. The report, the Borders and Conflict report, also highlights that drivers of political violence in borderlands are heavily dependent on the social and political context of each region. To what extent does this ring true in the Nigerian Lake Chad Basin region context?
Well, I think it is actually central to what we see in the Lake Chad borders, because if you look at the socio-political context across those border communities, first of all, if you look at the groupings, the ethnic groupings, people share not only history, but they share culture, they share economic resources. There are vast trading routes across the whole Lake Chad historically, where people have shared resources in those contexts.
Now, let's move to the second report, the recent report on political violence targeting women. And this report highlights the important point that violence targeting women thwarts their political participation through fear and intimidation. What is your take on that? And how do you view women's participation in both formal and informal peace processes, especially in border communities?
I think this report is very important, and it's important that we're talking about it now, in particular for Nigeria. As you know, we're coming up to an election year. So women's political participation is front and center on the agenda right now. And what we see in particular for us in terms of conflict in Nigeria and how it affects women is that the political actors are mostly non-state actors led by Boko Haram and more lately ISWAP. And also we have issues with banditry. And for all those groups, they have declared a war on women. In many senses, they have marginalized the participation of women, not just in the political space, but in society as a whole. In addition to that, they have declared women's bodies as part of the battlefield. So women are bearing the brunt. They kidnapped in large numbers. They are used as slaves in non-sexual capacities, but also as sexual slaves. So we see the shrinking of women's spaces by these political actors. And this is happening in communities where women already do not have much platforms, where women are already marginalized. So this is particularly worrying because I think a lot of these political actors in those spaces want to make women totally invisible. And when you come to talk about women's participation in the peace process, currently it's the numbers are so small And this is particularly worrying. There have been many attempts at negotiation with non-state actors, and there have been very few women at the negotiating table. If you look at decision makers in peace and security, at least in my own experience within the country that I live in Nigeria, there has been very, very little female participation. And yet we've seen the courage of women in this space. We've seen hunters, groups of women hunters that are leading men fighting these non-state actors. We've seen women members of civilian JTF. We've seen women community leaders. We've seen mothers who are protecting their communities. We've seen how women have risen to protect their children, to protect their families, to protect communities in the face of real adversity, in the face of real terrorism that we've seen meted on these communities by both bandits and terrorists. So women are playing key roles, but in a very unrecognized capacity. There is a lot of peace negotiations that happen within communities, and you see women really being active and coming up with multiple solutions. And in many communities, women are the gatekeepers of peace. Without women, there is no peace. And they have also a much more expansive view of what peace means. So if they are the scaffolding that holds the whole community together, uh, when regional or state or national uh, peace processes take place, then we have to ask the question, why are we not harnessing this resource? And we find also that when women are engaged in peace building at a very local level, you find that this peace holds because peace making is a very long term activity.
Yeah.
And it needs a lot of commitment, a lot of stamina, a lot of staying power. It's not something that you helicopter in and helicopter out. So what you find in these communities is that women are there for the long haul, and that's why when they are part of this peace making processes, that it has better chances of success.
And this really segues into the next question that I want to ask you, which is, we do know, and as you pointed out, conflict shapes society at many levels. And for women, the impact can be devastating, but it can also be a door to new opportunities. So, based off of your experience and the work that you do, can you tell us more about how women can be key levelers of change and peace in conflict affected areas?
Well, I think that, conflict has come with a lot of sadness, sorrow, devastation, destruction. And within that, there have been pockets of opportunity, and particularly for women. So, for example, what I see in a lot of communities that I work in, uh, there has been a more expanded role for women that never used to exist before. Women are stepping into spaces where they are perhaps vacuums, but they are holding their own. For example, there have been a lot of communities where men have been killed. So women are now stepping into the breadwinner role, and they are also looking after their families, and they are also now more actively participating in the economic space. I've seen the positive impact in terms of girls' education. Uh, because conflict has devastated communities in terms of not just psychologically, in terms of the trauma that they've experienced, but economically. So there is a more understanding that education is important, that education is a pathway to a better life, if you like. So we see more and more women encouraging their daughters and girls to go back to school. So the enrollment for girls in education has risen a lot in terms of conflict. And I think also the way that conflict has changed the role of women in society is that we see women as less passive in these very patriarchal societies, and they have become much more active. They are struggling to find platforms and voice, but in different communities, they are making huge gains. We've seen changes, for example, even in the health sector. We've seen men who didn't want their wives to go to hospital to have their babies because of cultural practices, cultural beliefs. And now we've seen more and more women who are becoming midwives and actually convincing these men to allow their wives to have safer deliveries in hospitals. So some of the changes have been subtle, but I think over time and in a generation, we will see that as a direct result of this conflict, the position and the role of women in some cases, in some communities, has evolved in a way and accelerated in a way that perhaps might not be possible um, as quickly as it's occurred without this conflict. But we also see women that are demanding more and more to be on negotiating tables and negotiating tables for peace. So women are really going into spaces that were traditionally held by men, where decisions are made. And so I think that is a big improvement, the understanding that when you have women on a peace table, when you have women in decision making spaces, whether it's a boardroom or in government, that the decisions are different. And I'll give you an example. Um, when I was in a senior position in government, in national security, I was usually the only female on a table full of men, usually security sector actors, mostly military. And their own version and vision of peace was very different from mine. They came from a mindset that putting resources in the military industry was a way to achieve peace. And I felt that the way to achieve peace was working with communities, working with people, going directly to the places where conflict happened, and that you can't do it without civil society. So I think just having a different perspective gives us a more rounded answers to these intractable problems that we have today. And
Yeah.
women are the center of that.
And thank you for sharing your experience in the security sector, especially as you were trying to build this program for Nigeria with countering violent extremism. So SWAC strives to better connect evidence-based analysis and data to civil society advocacy and action. How, in your opinion, can researchers and analysts work together with civil society organizations and women's groups to provide more contextualized research?
I think for me, as a civil society actor, what would be very useful is more collaboration. A lot of times we see that research are carried out by large organizations and institutions where we don't have access uh, to make input till the report is actually done. And very often we don't even have access to these reports. So there are a lot of really well researched documents that could provide us with evidence for our own planning and our own work, but we don't know how to access it. So I think sharing of research material uh, on wider dissemination platforms would be a start. And I also believe that uh, using some of our data, uh, I think we as civil society are so much closer to the people. We're there every single day. We have access to wide range of data, but this data could really inform some of the documents that are produced by large institutions. And we are always willing to share, to collaborate, to learn. So those are the three things. I think it's important that we share data, that we are included in the research process, and that when big organizations do research, that they make a substantial effort to make sure that civil society gets access to this data, whether it's by advertising them more, by having them on mailing lists that includes quite a lot of us. When we as civil society get research reports, for example, NEEM, we share it widely. We put it always on our website so that other NGOs can also access it.
Thank you, Dr. Akilu, for highlighting some of the concrete ways in which civil society can be more involved in the research process. This is particularly important when it comes to helping researchers improve the relevance of their work, which is ultimately key for better informed policy making. And this brings us to the end of our podcast episode. I would like to thank our guest once again, Dr. Fatima Akilu, the Executive Director of the NEEM Foundation Nigeria, for joining us. For more information on the publications referenced, they can be found on SWAC's MapTap platform or indeed on the OECD SWAC website. My name once again is Dr. Jumo Ayandele, your host, and this podcast was produced by the Sahel and West African Club Secretariat. Till next time, goodbye.